everyone, and we need to fight for change. Communities have the power to change the status quo. Change is hard fought, and we are committed to this fight. While we are navigating this unknown territory, we want to assure you that we are going to be by your side every step of the way as we figure out how to help Philadelphia business community overcome the challenges that lie ahead. We will continue to shift our programming and networking offerings to best support our members and guests, and we want to hear from you. So please provide suggestions. You can put your suggestions in the chat feature throughout the program today. So let's talk about a few of the details about today's event. We are recording this so that we can share it with you afterwards. You are encouraged to use the chat feature to ask questions, which we will look to answer at the end. Feel free to comment, make suggestions, and connect with each other. That's why we're here today. We will mute everyone to maintain audio and visual controls, but we may invite you to unmute at certain times. As a reminder, this is not a webinar. You are live on video, so we can see you. We certainly prefer it this way so everyone feels engaged, but if you do need to take care of business, feel free to turn off your video. CCPA is an intimate and diverse group of business owners, executives, and managers looking to build relationships and offer each other meaningful resources. That hasn't changed. We will continue to bring you unparalleled access to speakers, decision makers, and leaders who are shaping Center City. We will also continue to keep our members and guests informed about business challenges and opportunities in Philadelphia and help them become Center City smart. To touch on a little bit of our future programming, everything at this point is virtual, but our next lunch with city leaders is July 15th with the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. Women Changing the City is June 24th, and you can find a full schedule of our events on centercityproprietors.org. I'd like to acknowledge our sustaining sponsors, our preferred benefits provider, Michael Craig of Penworth Financial Services, and WeWork, the home of our headquarters. Lunch with City Leaders is presented by Citizens Bank and sponsored by the Community College of Philadelphia, Friedman LLP, KYW News Radio, Lev Lane, Pico, Post Brothers, and Visit Philadelphia. And now I'd like to welcome Lev Lane, President and CEO, and CCPA Vice President David Lane to say a few words and introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Suzette, and good afternoon, everyone. It's great to have you all here today. I'm very excited to introduce Jim. I was a journalism major at Penn State, and until we were lucky enough to have you, Jim, address our group today, I was not aware that there was a Lenfest Institute of Journalism. So I am very excited to hear all about it, as are the many others on our call. And I want to read a little bit about you and your background before we turn it over, because you have some very, very impressive credentials, and our listeners and viewers should be able to hear your accomplishments. So let me just say that you currently director of the Lenfest Institute for Journalism, an innovative nonprofit organization that supports local journalism in Philadelphia and nationwide. Founded by philanthropist Jerry Lenfest, who we all know, the Institute supports investigative news, newsroom diversity, and digital technology investment at our own local paper, the Philadelphia Inquirer, and throughout the Philadelphia news ecosystem. And the Institute is the owner of the Inquirer, now the largest newspaper in America owned by a nonprofit organization. And it leverages the Philadelphia Inquirer as a live lab for journalism innovation efforts nationwide. And you, Jim, you were a longtime executive at Dow Jones and Company, serving previously as group publisher of the Wall Street Journal for Europe, Asia, and the Americas, in charge of global business operations. And you were a board member of CNBC and co-founder of the journal's digital edition. So that's great stuff, and we're very honored to have you. So go ahead and take it away, Jim.
Thank you very much, David, Suzette, and Ben. Let me just check to make sure that you can hear me okay. Good. Thank you for that really gracious, exceedingly gracious introduction. I'm especially excited that I'm the warm-up act for the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, your next speaker. So that's really a dream come true. I wanted to introduce Annie Madonia, who is my colleague from the Lenfest Institute, who just waved. Annie is the head of advancement and runs a considerable amount of our operations and programming. And she has lived in Philadelphia for quite some time, and I had this same role with the Philadelphia Orchestra, the Cleveland Orchestra prior to that, and the United Way of Greater Philadelphia. As Annie's role implies, the Lenfest Institute is a philanthropy, and this is unusual and becoming less so in the world of journalism, which is changing business model quite rapidly. So what I wanted to propose today is a quick 4-part agenda. The first is that I better define and brief you on what is the Lenfest Institute. I'm not entirely surprised, David, that it was new to you. It's a relatively well-kept secret and not intended to be. The second agenda item I thought could be to discuss how we've invested our funds and partnered with others like William Penn and the Knight Foundation to help journalism in this marketplace and around the country, why that's important for local business, how it differs from other cities, and where we're putting our money and our mouth. The third, I wanted to kind of hone in on the coverage of the last 2-3 months, a health story, a political story, a racial story, and very much a business story. And last but not least, I would love to have a real conversation and not just answer questions, but hear what you have to say about journalism in this market and how it can help business. So does that sound good with everyone? Good. Thank you. So I think the best way to describe what the Lenfest Institute is and does is our origin story. The late Jerry Lenfest, at the tender age of 85, together with Lewis Katz, decided to buy the Philadelphia Inquirer. He thought it was, and I agree, a civic treasure and an extraordinarily important part of what makes Philadelphia, Philadelphia, that a great city should have a great newspaper for the benefit of all. Lewis died shortly after they purchased the newspaper, and in a tragic plane crash. And Jerry, who had not intended to be the operating partner, he was planning to be the passive investor, took control of the paper and as publisher. And he decided very quickly that it should be run as a philanthropy, that it should serve all of the people of Philadelphia. It should bear no debt. It should be run as a nonprofit. And he likened it to a great art museum, children's hospital, or Penn, where you have both earned revenue, tuition, patient revenue, in our case, subscriptions and advertising, but also donations. So we were launched in 2016 as the first major American newspaper run as a public trust and run as a philanthropy, as well as a public benefit corporation. And that means, in effect, that the Inquirer belongs to the city of Philadelphia. We are its stewards, but it belongs to the public service of the city of Philadelphia. And Annie and others have helped make that real from a philanthropy standpoint. We now have a couple of thousand donors, large and small, individual donors from $5 to $5 million, from readers of all stripes. We have received very substantial foundation support from the likes of the Knight Foundation, William Penn, our own funds, and Facebook and Google, who've helped us invest in our technology. So it's an innovative experiment. It is working. It's never been more needed than it is now, given what's at stake with our news coverage. What that means in very tangible terms is that the Inquirer has roughly 225 people in our newsroom. The company as a whole employs about 1,000, including drivers, printers, all the other business functions. But the core journalistic function is a robust local newsroom, we think among the largest regional newsrooms in the country, with 225 people. I'll give you a kind of controlled experiment. Prior to the Lenfest Cats effort, the Inquirer was owned by a couple of hedge funds, Angelo Gordon and Alden Capital. They had bought the paper when it was in distress. They were the debt. They foreclosed on the equity when it was controlled previously by Brian Tierney and a group of local investors. And they were in effect Mr. Potter in It's a Wonderful Life, the mean bankers. And they are very clear that they see these news assets. They own still about 80 newspapers around the country. They see them as oil wells. They see them as bonds. They take as much dividend as they can each year, usually 10, 15, 20%, and they make a tidy profit. And in Denver, where they own the Denver Post, a once great American newspaper, at the time that Lenfest and Katz took over the Inquirer had 250 people and in the newsroom, and the Denver Post had 275. The Denver Post now has 60. And this is covering the full state of Colorado and the capital. And we're still a robust 225. So that's in tangible business terms that one can understand what we've been up to. Does that make sense just from a structural standpoint, this kind of philanthropic parent and then an operating division? Good. We, as David said, we operate largely in Philadelphia to support the Inquirer, but we do so as a kind of live laboratory for what we think will work to sustain local news around the country. So a lot of our support comes from technology firms and from foundations that believe that we have a national impact, and we like to think that we do. The idea is that what happens in Philadelphia doesn't stay in Philadelphia, that Philadelphia should be once again the leader in free speech and the First Amendment that it has been since the late 18th century. As Jerry liked to say, we're better than Philadelphia to invent the future of free speech. Briefly, what we've been doing with our funds and funds that we've raised from others, we think about saving local news and sustaining local news as a business from three perspectives. The first is the news itself must have high impact. It must make a difference. It must influence policy. It must help business. Otherwise, it's not worth paying for. So at the end of the day, we want people to subscribe and support content that matters to them. So we've invested very significantly in investigative news, accountability journalism, business news and information, which is my background. And in, again, tangible business terms, that's meant when we started and took over in 2016, we had 6 investigative journalists working in Philadelphia. We now have 22 in Philly and in Harrisburg. In Philadelphia, we call them the I-Team. In Harrisburg, we call them Spotlight PA. And if you've seen the work on Toxic City, which is asbestos in public schools, on data and data transparency from the state level, investigations of problems in nursing homes, data visualizations of how the virus is performing. All these kinds of things come from that investment. The second area is technology. If no matter how high impact the journalism is in theory, if the technology doesn't deliver it in a pleasant and usable way, increasingly to people's phones, no longer to the desktop, and obviously for many no longer in print, then all is lost. So we've tried to bring the Inquirer not only into the 21st century, but to the cutting edge of investment in news technology. The first investment was we looked around and thought that the Washington Post under Jeff Bezos's ownership was the best of breed in news technology and how the news was presented and how it worked on mobile. So we have licensed their publishing system. We were the first to do so. It was a function of the fact that we're nonprofit. They thought we were Switzerland and not a competitor. So we've benefited from that. We have since invested significantly in new mobile platforms and new video and new presentation technologies, which hopefully you've noticed and you'll notice more. And the last of the three-legged stool of the news, the technology, is diverse and growing audiences. Unless the news reaches the growing parts of Philadelphia, which are younger, more diverse, more female than the current audience or the historic audience, then we're not a growing business. So we see diversity, equity, and inclusion not only as a moral imperative in our country and in our city and in our business, but a business imperative. We think we do this effectively or we don't have an audience in the long run. So we want to do good and do well at the same time. I wanted to sort of telescope into what began to happen in mid-February and kind of accelerated from there. And that is, as you all know from your own businesses and your own lives, the advent of COVID-19. Literally overnight, and I think it was March 9th or March 10th, I received a call from our editor and then our publisher saying that a group of our journalists, 3 or 4, had gone to an investigative news conference. They spent the week, bumping elbows but in a small confined space. And it was a period when we were all kind of aware of the virus, but not sheltering yet. And they received word by email afterwards that 2 people from another news organization had tested positive for COVID-19. And they had been to work for a couple of days after that at the Inquirer. And we made the decision, led by Lisa Hughes, who is the new CEO of the Inquirer, and prior to that, the publisher of the New Yorker, to close the newsroom, disinfect the newsroom, and change mode. And at the time we thought, we'll clean the place up and people will move back in. And it quickly became clear that we would be operating virtually. I think we've just been joined, or were joined a little bit ago, by Tony Cuffey, who is a good friend and giveaway, a leading advertising executive at the Philadelphia Inquirer. So, hey, Tony, nice to see you. All 1,050 employees of the Inquirer have been operating under COVID protocols ever since that time. Some people, like the drivers and the pressmen, have to come to work to do their jobs. Many of the reporters and many of the photojournalists are out in the field doing the work, and not only not sheltering, but actively exposing themselves to risk. So the story from the Narbeth ambulance that only picks up COVID patients by a photographer and a Pulitzer Prize winning reporter as an example. The video and accompanying story from inside the temple COVID hot zone is another example. And now over the past week or two, we've had 24 people out in the field, photographers, videographers, and reporters, in some cases being tear gassed, in a couple of cases being arrested, but doing the essential work of essential journalism. So that's meant good news and bad news, business-wise. The good news is that the audience for the Philadelphia Inquirer, a 191-year-old publication, has skyrocketed. We've actually had a I think I was muted for a moment, but our audience has skyrocketed during the COVID crisis, and to put numbers to that, on any given day in normal times, the Inquirer has about 300,000 people visiting digitally over the phone or over their desktop at some point during the day. Many, repeat visits, but the daily audience in digital is about 300,000. Tony can tell us the daily audience in print is probably about that or a little bit less. Someday it's much bigger. The record prior to COVID was when the Eagles won the Super Bowl, and that was blown out of the water with daily usage of about 1 million, 1.2 million people, or 3 to 4 times what we had been seeing previously. The bad news is that print advertising, which is driven by businesses like yours, has pretty much evaporated. And that has been, even as we shift to digital, a very big source of profit. So there's been quite meaningful headwind to the business at the same time as there's been the largest audience in history. And I think we all thank God that we had Jerry Lenfest and a very, very supportive and growing community of donors to make all this work. This is something that numerous newspapers are saying they wish they'd done this 3 years ago. There's a line about the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. So we planted a tree 4 or 5 years ago to sustain this great civic treasure. There has been a change in, if you are readers, you'll see, to real-time publishing. We have not for the last several years waited until a print deadline to publish our digital content, but the digital content was updated 3, 4, or 5 times throughout the day, depending upon the news. It is now updated in real time. Particularly the COVID coverage, there is a real-time box that is a live blog of any changes, any updates on COVID, on protests, on all the events of the day. And I think we feel like we'll never go back. This will always now be a real-time news resource because the audience is there for it. We also feel, and I'll wrap up on this point, that the story of COVID-19 has evolved and will continue to evolve. It started as actually a foreign story, what's happening in this part of China, and then it seems like it's hit Italy, and then it became very much a local health story, and quite quickly an economic story, a story of recession, now a race story about the disproportionate impact of the virus on communities of color, and as always, the disproportionate impact of recession or depression on communities of color, and the social and political and protest fallout from all that. So we feel like we're in a very, very strong position to continue to tell this story with Philadelphia. And I would love to hear how it is for you as readers and as business owners. And I might lean on Tony or Annie, since we're here in numbers as well. So Ben, why don't we open it up?
We can use chat feature, but I think if people want to unmute themselves, obviously one at a time, for questions, you should be able to if somebody wants to start.
I see. Actually, it was a comment from Paul. Is it Steinke?
Yes.
Wasn't the St. Petersburg Times owned by the Poynter Institute the first newspaper owned by a nonprofit? Yes. Jerry kind of said that he's sort of studied at the feet of the Poynter Institute. The Poynter Institute is an educational foundation. They do newsroom training, and they're a different kind of entity. We're actually a public charity, but they own the St. Petersburg Times, and now called the Tampa Bay Times. You're absolutely correct.
Heather, did you have a question?
Yeah, I don't so much have a question, but a comment. You've done a great job on your technology access. 3 years ago, trying to read the paper on my phone was really hard, and it's really come together. You can tell a big difference. So you've done a great job.
Thank you. We don't always hear that, Heather. I appreciate it. I think it's a much better experience than it was. There's a kind of term of art about being digital first, meaning publishing first to digital, not holding for print, thinking digitally. And that's evolved to mobile first, meaning having content that doesn't look and feel like it was designed for a desktop and kind of shrunk down to this thing called a phone, when really at all demographic levels, Inquirer readers are getting their news over the phone. So,
can I jump in on that, Jim?
Yeah, please, Tony.
So when a couple years back, we tried unfortunately a local company in a redesign, and they had some success with easier sites, but ours being multi-layered proved to be difficult. So like I knew we had a problem because I teach martial arts. On the side, I guess it's not really a job, it's just something I do, I enjoy, but I have a lot of kids. And so I knew we had a problem, and I had moms coming up to me with their phones saying, I can't get to, they knew I worked. I can't get to my, so one of the things that was one of the things we knew we had to deal with a couple of years back. And I'm pleased to hear that folks are happy with it. So, and just a little context to that.
I have a question, Jim.
Wait, sorry, Nina, did you still have a question? Oh, okay.
Oh, I sent something to Jim, so he can address it when there's time.
Oh, good, I will, thanks.
Thank you.
David?
Yeah, Jim, what do you see as the future for journalists, young people in the colleges and universities studying journalism, becoming writers? Is that part of the mission of the Institute to affect the quality of young writers so they go into the newspaper industry?
It's a great question, David, and I'll come at it from a couple of different angles, as you did. What is our role, and what's the kind of macro trend? I'm not sure that how long this will last, but we're in a kind of bull market right now for young people wanting to be journalists. A number of us got into the field on the heels of Watergate. We all wanted to be Woodward and Bernstein. I was the high school newspaper editor when Nixon resigned, and these guys were our heroes. Since the last election and the attacks on the free press and the phrase that journalists are the enemy of the American people, and the influence that we have seen journalism exert on social justice, whether you're progressive or conservative. Stories like the Me Too story that broke in the New York Times, written by two young women, that had global impact. And initially Harvey Weinstein, but then went global, have attracted a great deal of interest. And the last I heard, a year or so ago, applications to some of the key journalism schools like Columbia, CUNY, Temple, School of Media and Communication were up 40%. So, and the disproportionate to the population, these have been young women and often women of color. So I think there's a sense that journalism is back as a cause and as a career. And it is not the highest paying field, and I think people are there with their hearts, more so than their wallets. What we've tried to do is encourage this trend and also take advantage of it. So we started something called the Lenfest Fellows, and this was initially 6 young journalists of color who were either undergraduate journalism majors or graduate journalists with a year or 2 of experience and good native digital skills. And we brought them into the newsroom for 2 years. We've since renewed that program. It's pretty widely supported by donors. We found that at our newspaper and others that doesn't completely solve the problem of diverse representation, that often the pipeline is simply that, kind of an early pipeline, and then people leave for other news organizations. And the competition from digital news organizations or television is quite stiff because they can pay better. And we've begun investing more recently in the mid to senior levels of new people. Did that answer the question, David? Thanks.
Paul Stanky, question?
Thank you, Ben, and thank you, Jim. And thanks for answering that question about the St. Pete, or I guess Tampa Bay Times now. I've been a daily newspaper reader since I was 10 years old. I went to the doctor's office, had a long wait, and decided to read that day's evening bulletin from cover to cover. And barely a day has gone by in my life since then where I haven't held a newspaper in my hand and read it. And I start every single day with the home-delivered Philadelphia Inquirer. I also use the website multiple times a day. But my question for you is, with the fall off in print advertising, how much longer do you think you can really keep up home delivery? I kind of dread the day when I have to use my iPad to read the paper every day. How much longer do you think home delivery has to go with the Philadelphia Inquirer?
Thanks, Paul. It's a very good question, and it's one that we get a lot, and I wish I had a definitive answer. We don't know. The Inquirer makes money on its home delivered subscription business. It's the biggest part of the business. It's a loyal group, as you are. I'm sure you've noticed that over the years, you've been paying more and more for the paper. And that's because it gets less and less subsidy from advertising than it did in the past. So the general business view is, as long as we can make it a business, and we subsidize the business as the nonprofit. But as long as it sustains itself, as long as readers like you want it, we will try to be there. There is a lot of discussion in kind of future of journalism circles about a kind of generational shift to digital, and watching closely some experiments in Europe and other markets, which is Sundays only plus digital during the week. The Sunday paper has always been the most profitable and the deepest read. And if you look closely at the New York Times, for example, the best offer, when you sign up for the New York Times, their systems will encourage you very strongly to take Sunday plus digital. That's the most profitable for them. So I think in a 10-year horizon, that's where a lot of us will be, including the kind of big stalwart papers like the New York Times and the Washington Post, but I really don't know.
Jim, to add to Paul's, my concern is I read so much at night that when I wake up and get my paper, I've read everything in it already. So that may not be the advertising, but that's a concern at that point. I don't know if that's any different for your answer, but
I think that's a factor. There's some art and science to when stories are released to digital versus the print paper, and sometimes it's not even you read it digitally at night and it's in the printed paper, which I think is hard to avoid. There's the peak readership digitally in the week is Wednesday, Thursday, and the peak readership in print is Sunday. So some of the big investigative news and the gorgeous work the Inquirer did with support from William Penn on the Delaware watershed, for example, was published during the week, and it gains audience and kind of social media following throughout the week, and then you get it on Sunday. There's different audiences for the two, but there is certainly some overlap, including you.
Michelle, do you still have your question?
Sure, yeah. First of all, Jim, thank you so much. As someone who is in the publishing world, I'm the lead copy editor, proofreader, and researcher for a small publishing company called GTA Books, stands for Global Travel Authors. Just coming from the publishing world, I really, am thankful so much for the opportunity to meet you and really admire the work that you've done, with the Institute. And my question to you was,
you too.
Oh, thank you so much. My question to you was, what are your thoughts with all the pervasive fake news and disinformation out there? I just wanted to hear your thoughts on it, and what kind of initiatives or projects, on the Inquirer or at the Institute that you guys are working on, and just your thoughts in general on this unfortunate pervasive trend.
Well, the first is it is an unfortunate and pervasive trend, and it's funny. Jerry Lenfest, who I told once was that he reminded me of a kind of 86-year-old millennial. One of his concerns about the Inquirer and newspapers in general was that when they went digital, you wouldn't know what to believe. He didn't use the phrase fake news, but he said that the internet is a free-for-all, and newspapers sometimes get it wrong and issue corrections, but there is at least an accountability, and there's a brand that stands behind it. How do you know what you're reading on the internet? There are several companies that act as a kind of monitoring system for for fake news on the internet. We have been involved with one called First Draft Media, and First Draft looks at, scans the horizon mainly around electoral politics, and tries to identify fake news and flag it as such. We work with another company called NewsGuard, which was a former Wall Street Journal publisher, Gordon Krovitz, which has hired a couple of hundred journalists to look at thousands of sites and identify whether they're green, amber, or red. It's a kind of nutrition label or seal of good housekeeping for what is fake news. A lot of it is less outright fake, like the tweet that said that the Pope had endorsed Donald Trump during the election, which is completely specious. It's more political news or news with bias, left or right, masquerading as real news, and often with names like the Colorado Gazette, which sounds like a newspaper, but it's in that case a right-wing pack, and there's many on the left as there are on the right. So we're highly sensitized to it. We're more users of these services than primary investors in them. We think there's been a lot of money and a lot of effort that have gone into this. But thanks for the question. There's a couple of questions in chat, and one or two were sent privately. So if it's okay, I'll read those, and you tell me when you're all out of time.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
I'd wait for the waiter to bring the check, and everyone could go back to work. But that's a thing of the past for now. So Nina asked,
dessert was on the way.
Nina asked the question: was the Institute involved in the attached apology statement? And she included the link. You may or may not have seen a public apology that was issued by the editors of the Inquirer last night or this morning. And I'll give you the background and then tell you how we were or were not involved. Many of you would know the renowned architecture columnist and critic, Inga Safran. Inga is one of our most treasured reporters and columnists. She writes about architecture, the life of the city, and urban renewal, and has a national reputation. And she won the Pulitzer Prize for criticism as a result. A few days ago, Inga wrote a story that online has the headline, "Damaging buildings disproportionately hurts the very people protesters are trying to uplift." And it talked about how long-term building destruction and property destruction can be, and how devastating to particularly vulnerable neighborhoods. She looked back 56 years after riots in North Philly as to the state of shopping districts and in predominantly African-American neighborhoods. And the damage has been permanent. And the way that the Inquirer and other print newspapers work is that the headlines are often written by other people. And in this case, the headline that was published in print was "Buildings Matter Too." And this was seen and read widely inside and outside of the Inquirer as a slur on Black Lives Matter, and reminiscent of others saying all lives matter or white lives matter. It seemed to equate lives with property, and especially Black lots of property. It was deeply offensive, and there was a very significant public and internal reaction to it. Inquirer, to its credit, decided quite quickly, really in real time, to apologize. The editor-in-chief responded to the initial tweets about this, saying this was unfortunate, this was a mistake, this was an error, and it should never have been printed. And they went on to publish I think, deeply felt apology and to suggest ways in which they hope to improve. They also let readers, and I hope this is a trend in journalism, actually it's an observable trend. They let readers into the process of how did this happen? And most readers don't know that headline writing is often separate from story writing. Inga herself was not happy about it and said so publicly. So that's what the question was about. We were an observer and I think an encourager of transparency and aggressive action about this, but we didn't take direct control. That's not our role. We're a nonprofit owner and thought this was the work of the editors and the CEO. Tony, you were inside the company, if not inside the building. Do you think I got that right, or did I gloss over anything?
No, you nailed it.
Okay.
You nailed it.
Thank you. We do a lot of we're party to a lot of research about trust in media, and one of the things that engenders the most or the least trust in media is transparency, the willingness to admit an error and to try to correct it and to not glad hand your way out of it. Apologies that are real and substantive and followed through upon. Engender trust and engagement as they should, just like any other relationship. We also find that transparency in the process, the reason that you see in the New York Times or the Inquirer that the reporter says they interviewed 16 people for this story is they want you to know precisely how much research they did. And I think you'll see more and more of that. The trend is sort of analogous to the math problem, show your work. So I think that transparency is really key.
Do you see any other questions, or does anybody have questions?
I'm trying to back up in the chat. I can't figure out how to do it.
Paul was commenting on worthwhile content in print that is missed online. I guess the question would be, are there articles that sometimes are only for print edition? Everything printed that's written?
I think just about everything by definition in print is published digitally, but not necessarily the other way around. Especially some of the real-time blogs and coverage don't make it into print, either because they're not timely or relevant or up to date at the time, or because they just don't lend themselves to that. Tony, there may be feature stuff, that special sections and feature material that doesn't make it to digital.
Yeah, I mean, what happens quite often, and I was going to actually jump in on the special features part of it, sort of the way the newspaper is constructed kind of makes for a contiguous sort of approach to encountering the content. where the online it requires a bit more proactivity to get to things. So when you're concluding a story as you flip through the paper, then you sort of run into another story, where it doesn't quite work like that online sometimes. And then you have special sections that will appear in different places on the site. So it's not that difficult to miss something online unless you're specifically looking for that particular item, because of that sort of like the way a newspaper, the continuity of the way it's laid out is really the biggest part of that, because you have individual landing pages, frankly, that happens.
Got it.
We're trying to make that better, though.
There's something called the replica edition, which is a PDF of the newspaper itself that you can read. That is literally just a photographic image of every page of the newspaper, and I've been especially glued to it during the COVID period.
Harry, are you there and have a question?
Yeah, I'm here. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Harry, how are you?
I'm good.
I thought you were high-fiving me.
How about do that too? I don't know if my video's on. But of course, I'm going to ask about food and your food section.
Yeah.
And whether the growth in the rest of the online traffic is accompanied by a similar growth, maybe even more rapid growth in attention to the food parts of the paper. I love Michael Klein and Victor Fiorillo and the stuff Huey does on food. And it's the only part of the paper that I always consume every day. So I'm just curious if you speak to that a little bit, and whether it's going to be future growth, and also if it helps fuel revenue. Is there revenue generated by that editorial base that rides along with it?
I think I have almost entirely good news in response, Harry. The two areas of content that attract the most traffic outside of breaking news, kind of hard news, are sports and food. And during COVID, the sports section, since there's no active professional sports, has many of those writers have been redeployed and are covering health and wellness and other areas. They in many cases are the best writers and have the biggest digital followings in the whole paper. And there's a really significant commitment to food. There's a new food editor who is less visible to you than the columnists, but Craig Levan and so forth's boss is a woman named Jamila Robinson, who came to us from the Atlantic, and she's very dynamic. The publisher, Lisa Hughes, announced plans shortly before COVID to hold a food festival and a kind of celebration of Philadelphia food, which is currently on hold. But we see it very much as experiential, in person, very democratic, not an elite approach to five-star or 3-bell restaurants only. So it's moving very much in the direction I think you'd like to see, and it's a big traffic driver, and I think, Tony, during normal times, an advertising driver as well, certainly a subscription driver.
Yeah, food is interesting, and it will continue to be an ongoing focus, I believe, for the organization. What's interesting about it, pure ag guy talking here, is the audience that it draws, but not necessarily the advertisers that it draws, because there's really no tactful way of saying this, but the men are terrible advertising targets. Bad, right? I mean, like, not to make it, a gender thing, but, most women are thinking about, a lot of women are thinking about, winter coats in the fall, whereas a guy walks out and says, it's cold, I need a coat. So it's a different sort of like mindset. And what happens though is food is a great uniter of people. And some people, make their biggest adventure trainings and discoveries of new dining experiences and new things to try outside of what they may have normally eaten. So like when you look at the audience itself from the even in the print product, and this has been going on for a number of years, it's interesting when you consider who the audience is for that, and that's what makes it attractive from an advertising standpoint.
Got it. If we're getting close to the end of our time, I'll make a business point, since this is a business gathering on at least one level. There's a whole battery of evidence about what happens when you have a thriving local news ecosystem, a flagship newspaper like the Inquirer, good solid NPR station, good local TV like 6ABC or NBC 10, and when you don't. And unfortunately, it's crystal clear in many markets, which we now call news deserts, where the news has really dried up. Worse than Denver, which I referenced. Youngstown, Ohio, daily newspaper, gone. And we'll see more and more of this, I fear. One of the things that happens is that people vote less. Political dialogue becomes more shrill and more polarized, because people are losing the sense of a single voice or a single meeting place. They just talk to their own social feeds and echo chambers, and business becomes harder. And in specific tangible terms, the cost of borrowing, the cost of municipal debt, the cost of doing business tends to go up, because bond buyers understandably view the place as more risky. And we've seen this across multiple markets. There's a little chicken and egg question, because markets that are economically in distress tend to lose their newspapers. So, but it seems very clear that the presence of investigative news and accountability journalism, while an individual business might not always like what they read, is actually good for business. And that was my firm belief at the Wall Street Journal, and very much so with the Philadelphia Inquirer. So it's in our self-interest to make sure that we maintain it and enhance it.
If I could sneak one more comment in.
Please.
Jim?
Please.
Yes. Yeah. CCPA is a business organization, absolutely. And just possibly, we think there is opportunity for the Inquirer to do an improved job in that particular area. I read the Journal and I read the Times, and between the two, I kind of get both sides of the story, the full story, and I find myself a lot less drawn to the business section of the Inquirer. And not that I thought we were going to get into talking about sections and stuff like that, but we have kind of started to talk about some of that. So from an opportunity from a business organization, we kind of look towards the Philadelphia Business Journal, which is focused on that and a competitor in business. And also there's opportunity for the Inquirer for business stories, good business stories that offer kind of all sides of the view, all sides of an industry and some of the challenges that industries have. I mean, that's what I would like to see, and I can't speak for anyone but myself, but just my own personal reading habits that sometimes I am captivated by a business story in the Inquirer, but many times I feel that there's opportunity for the newspaper to do better.
You are speaking for yourself, David. I appreciate that, but it's not the first time I've heard it. To be candid, one of the challenges, I think, is a sense of the paper, of the business section knowing who it is and what it is. Is it for individual investors and kind of your money matters? Is it covering the Fortune 500 or publicly listed companies in the Philadelphia region? Is it the place to go for the most comprehensive inside look at Comcast? Does it focus on the business of eds and meds? And I think it's, I agree that some of the coverage is much, much better than others. And I think it's worth noting. We are going to be focused in the next few months, and we'll announce this publicly, but on the future of work, meaning the future of family sustaining jobs and the future of employment and job creation in Philadelphia. That's at the intersection of tax policy, business policy, economic development, recovery from COVID-19, et cetera. And so I think you can expect an intensive look at the business dimensions of the recovery. The corporate, what you're talking about, I think, is corporate news companies. And I think that is a to-do. Some of it is very strong, some of it is not.
Thank you.
I sometimes hear that the voice also is skeptical, even anti-business, and that's another question. What is the role of journalism in looking over business's shoulder? And I think that's less an issue for the business journal, who are there as a business.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, the stories I like to read are kind of covered from all sides. It's not just the one side, but it's a balance. That's journalism, right? It's that very objective look at all sides of an equation.
Right. That's the idea.
It's the idea. Thank you.
Well,
yeah.
Wait, somebody's. Anyway, yeah, I didn't see any questions. I see somebody joining us, but Em, thank you for your time. This has been great, especially as a longtime reader and past delivery boy before this. I used to wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning to wake up my neighbor so we could go on our delivery route. But I just want to thank everybody for coming when there's so much going on, and you for your time. And Tony, I know advertising is tight right now, but I've always remembered that you gave us a lot of advertising for our members at one of our events we did, where 5 people won a big advertising package. That made a big impact on them. So thank you for that. If anybody wants to stay and hang out a little bit, I'll be here. I got nowhere to go.
Thank you very much. I really, really have enjoyed this and really appreciate it. And appreciate your interest in the topic of journalism and the Inquirer, including constructive criticism. That's what makes us better. So I'm honored to talk to you today, and I hope to do it in person at some point in 2025 or whenever this thing.
Please, no.
Exactly.
Jim, I want to thank you too, because the paper, it's our lifeline. You know, I'm in the PR business, so I need the paper, but I've read it my entire life, and it's just an honor to be here today with you. So thank you.
Well, thanks, Charlotte. Thank you all.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Jim.
Much. Thanks.
Thanks, Jim.
Everybody,
Thank you.
nice seeing you all.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Ben.
Yeah.
Thanks, Tony.
Thank you so much.
Hey, Dawn.
Hi, Ben. Thank you.
How are you
I
doing?
enjoyed it. Pretty good. You see me on the beach?
It looks so nice.
It does. I'm looking forward to getting there.
Yeah.
The weather
yeah.
is really nice out. It feels like I'm there without the water.
Is that any particular beach? Any favorite beach?
Good question. I haven't found out what this beach is yet.
Well, it's got a palm tree, so
Yes.
I don't know if that means Hawaii. It could be
Yeah.
anywhere.
Yeah, it's definitely a beach I need to go to.
Yeah.
Yes. Hi,
All right.
Megan. Pretty good. Yeah. All right. Guess
All right.
Harry's on there.
Can't tell if Harry. We can't tell if you're stuck or if you're still there.
That's what I thought, maybe frozen.
I know, right? And is it Dennis on the line?
At least we all have
There he
power.
is. You're on mute. He's on mute. You're on
Yeah,
mute.
just
I
there
was
you go.
on
You're
the
good.
camera while I was eating lunch. During the call, I biked from City Hall to Reading Terminal, got lunch, and then ate it during the meeting.
I'm
Yes,
about
that's
to
a
have lunch
benefit.
now.
I was eating food while I was talking about food.
That's funny. What did you have for lunch?
You know, Tootsie's, the salad bar is open again at the Reading Terminal. You can't help yourself, but somebody follows you around and you tell them what to put on your salad.
That's
really
funny.
Yeah.
That is funny.
Yeah.
Oh,
But they touch
boy.
it, but you don't.
Exactly.
I was wondering how I was going to work out, like with the casinos and like the salad bars and the restaurants.
Well, we're all in the event business. Kate Stockton, you still on the call?
No, she's gone.
Yeah.
Anyway, we're all in the midst of talking nationally and internationally with everybody in the business trying to figure out what events are going to look like in the future. And there are lots of caterers are the most innovative people in the food business. Restaurants make the most food, but caterers, delivery systems are amazing. And there's some amazing things you're going to see in the future. So,
Yeah, I guess
That's
from
promising.
delivery to the way it's packaged to the way it's
Yep.
served.
Yep. All kinds of new stuff coming up.
Yeah.